In the last section, we spoke about the concept of state in our components. As a reminder, we use state to track user interactions, and we do that so that we can re-render our components at any given time without having flashes of content on the screen appear to the user. An example we used to illustrate that was a dropdown. So if I have a dropdown that was open at some given time and a user did something that would cause me to re-render that component, the dropdown would not all of a sudden snap closed because it would remember, oh, that's right, I'm supposed to be open right now. So we're going to, in this section, we're going to be making our own dropdown component. And so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start by copy pasting our thumbnail gulp folder. Thumbnail gulp was the culmination of all of our tooling that we ran through. So I'm going to copy and paste. And I'm going to rename this as just dropdown. Great. I'm going to open up dropdown inside my code editor. And we're going to start by opening our source file and looking at some of the stuff that we have in here. So in the last section, we decided that we're going to build our dropdown by using our badge component and modifying our thumbnail list right here. So let's get started. We're going to start inside of app.jsx. And inside of app.jsx, we're just going to do kind of like, we're going to start by really cleaning house inside of here. So no longer are we going to need a thumbnail list. Instead, we're going to want a dropdown. And we're going to import our dropdown from inside the same directory as the app.jsx file right here. So we're going to say, look at the current directory and get the file name dropdown. Let's create that file right now. So we're going to create a new file inside of src, and it's just going to be called dropdown.jsx. So dropdown is going to be the place where we render our badge, basically our button, and the place that we render our list. Dropdown is also going to contain some logic about whether or not the dropdown should be currently open. So let's take some notes in here really quick. You don't have to do this. I'm just going to remind myself. We need to show a button and a list. This component should know when to show the list based on when the user clicks on a button. Great. So we'll go back over to app.jsx. All of the options that we had in here, as if you recall, these were being used to provide props to our thumbnail list. We're still going to have options we want to pass down, but they're going to take a totally different form. So we're going to go ahead and delete all this for right now. And instead, we're going to make a different options object. And for us, if we we'll go ahead and kind of think through our the properties that our dropdown is going to need. To do that, let's flip over to Bootstrap really quick, and on the Components tab, and we'll click Dropdowns, and we'll just kind of look at the data that we might need to render a dropdown. So really, we need a title for the button right here, and then we need a list of items that's going to appear inside of the dropdown. So with that kind of thought process, we might have properties in here which would be title. So title would be basically what should show up on the button to open, close the dropdown. And for our case right here, we're going to be making a dessert themed dropdown. So we'll just say choose a dessert. I think I just spelled desert. Let's fix that up. And then our list of items. And the items in here will basically be each of the items that should appear up as a line item. So our items is going to be very simple. It's just going to be a list of different dessert items. And we'll say you can have apple pie, peach cobbler, or cocoa nut cream pie. Fantastic. Okay, so again, the title is what's going to show up on the open and close dropdown, and the items are list of items to show in the dropdown. So it's always very handy to remember exactly what properties we're passing into our element. All right. Now that we have our options to pass in, we're going to revise our React.create element here. So we're no longer making a thumbnail list. We're making a dropdown. Okay. So next, let's go back into dropdown, and we're going to be making our actual dropdown component. So we know that we need to require React in here, just as we do for all of our components. And then let's think about what else we'll need. Well, we're going to need basically our badge component, and we're also going to need what we're going to be using for our list, our unordered list. So let's import var badge from the current directory. And we'll also import our list. And we're just going to call that list. So again, we don't need our thumbnail list anymore. So I'm going to come over here and we're going to delete thumbnail and thumbnail list JSX. And then we'll hold off on making our list component for just right now. Let's keep working on the actual dropdown. So just as usual, when using when making a reusable component, whenever we write code inside of a reusable component, we export it using module.exports. So we'll write module.exports equals react.create class. Then we're going to pass that an object, just like usual, which will have the render function. And we'll say return div. Now, if you think back to our example with the dropdown, the example CSS we had, to make everything show up correctly with Bootstrap, with the CSS right here that we're going to try to reuse, we need, on the top level component, we need a class of dropdown. So our dropdown, with it inside of its wrapper div right here, we're going to give class name of just dropdown. Great. So before we throw in our badge component, let's consider its use a little bit more. Our current badge shows a button, and as a matter of fact, we can just find it over here. So I'm going to click badges on the right-hand side. So here's our current badge. Our current badge shows a button with some text on it and a number. So again, we don't really want to have a number in here anymore. We don't really want to have this be a badge at all. So we really need to repurpose this thing. It needs to be something more generic, something that anyone can use, that we could use again just as like a normal button. So instead of continuing to call this a badge, because a badge is really, a button with a number, we want it to just be a normal button. So to reflect that, I'm going to rename this file badge to just button. And then instead of importing a badge, we're going to say that we're going to import a button. And we're just doing this to reflect that we are making not a badge anymore, we're making a much more generic component. Let's go ahead and put our button in here. Great. So our button needs to know really two things here. It needs to know the title, right? It needs to know the title that it should show, and then also needs to know what classes it should have. The reason we're going to be specifying classes is that there are many different types of buttons available in Bootstrap. So we're going to handle making a reusable button by telling it what classes it should be using. And it's going to be able to allow us to use a single button component, but give the appearance of different types of buttons on here. So if I can, let's try to find buttons on this list over here. I'm not immediately seeing it. Oops, I want CSS. Let's just look for a button. There we go. Here we go. So whenever we use the Bootstrap buttons, there's different types of buttons we can show. And the way that the button appears is based solely on the class. provided to it. So for just kind of this normal looking button, we would give it class button default. We could give it button primary, button success. And when I say button success, I'm talking about these class names on here. BTN info, button warning, button danger, and blah, blah, so on and so on. So we're trying to make a component here that is just one single button that we're just going to keep on using from now on. So if we want to make a single button, we really need to be able to customize it by providing a custom class. So to do this, we're going to give it its own class name. And then internally, that class name is going to be applied on the button, and it's going to customize how the button looks. So in our case, we just want a normal looking button. So we'll just say button default. Next, we also want to tell this button its title. And so we'll say this.props.title. As a reminder, we're pulling this title property right here from the definition of our options object inside of app.jsx. So our button should show with title, choose a dessert. Okay, now let's jump inside of button, and we're going to do a little bit of a refactor to make sure that it actually applies this class name and makes use of this title right here. So we'll click into button. It looks like our title is going to be fine. We shouldn't need to change that, but we do need to change our class name up here. So to do so, we're going to just change up the way that the class name gets applied to this component a little bit. We're going to delete this, and instead we're going to change the code here to conditionally apply or not conditionally, but just to say, hey, if we have a class name on our properties object, then we should apply it to our class name for the button. So we'll just say this.props.className, and then close it with a curly brace. And then don't forget to put a space in between button in here, so that if there is a class name, it should show up as btn space btn dash default. So now whenever we render our button right here, it's going to say, okay, I'm going to render a button. It will have class btn, and any additional class name that we provide to it will also be added on. If we provide any title, it'll show that. And then the only thing left that we need to change is say if we have a, instead of a number from now on, since this is just going to be like a normal looking button, we'll add a second item on here. So to do so, instead of rendering a span that shows a number every time, we're going to be rendering a span that shows a subtitle. And the thought here is that if we want to still use our button as a badge, we totally can. We would just provide, instead of a property called number, we would provide a property called subtitle. And you'll see why we're doing this in just a second here. The other thing we're going to do is, instead of always showing a class name of badge, we'll say this.props.subtitle class name. Okay, so let's go back over to our dropdown, and we're going to give this one more little property here, and it'll be subtitle class name equals caret. So let's think about what we've done here really quick. We refactored our badge to be just a button. We can optionally pass in a class name of button default. We can pass in our title, which will be the text that it displays on the button. And then we can provide a subtitle class name that gets applied to the span that's contained within inside the button. If we wanted to, we could also provide a subtitle of, maybe a number or what have you. And that would show as the additional text inside of our button. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like in real life. I'm going to save the file, open our console. I'm going to change into our drop-down folder, and then I'm going to run gulp. Oh, looks like we've got a little bit of an error in here. Cannot find module list. So we haven't actually put our list in here yet. So I'll just comment this line out, This is what's asking for list right here, and Browserify is just saying, hey, you're asking for list, but I can't find it. And it looks like it automatically recompiled, and we're good. So let's go ahead and find our HTML file inside of dropdown. Here we go. And we'll open it up. Great. So here's our button right here. It shows the text we provided, and it shows a little caret as our subtitle. Now the caret's getting kind of close on there, so we're just going to make a quick little change inside of index.html right here. We're just going to do an inline style inside of our head tag, and we're just going to say btn caret margin left 5 pixels. This is totally optional right here. This is just going to clean up the button a little bit by inserting a little bit of a margin between the word dessert and the caret. So let's refresh, and there we go. So we got just a little bit more space in there, so it looks a little bit more reasonable. So let's go ahead and click on the button, and nothing happens. That's right. So we aren't showing a list on here yet, and our button also doesn't know how to respond to being clicked. So let's tackle that in our next section.